back to Games as Lit 101's analysis of the Gears of War trilogy. This is the final entry in a series of 4 videos analyzing the Gears of War trilogy from a narrative perspective, highlighting the storytelling and narrative themes of the series, as well as the myriad ways in which it, unfortunately, fails to effectively communicate them. If you haven't already, I highly recommend starting with the first 3 videos in this series, since this one continues off of them. So now that we've taken a look at the entire Gears of War series, it's time we... Okay, fine. Judgment is a piece of crap. It had a really interesting premise, with a story being told in retrospect by 4 different narrators, but completely failed to make anything even mildly interesting out of that, even squandering the opportunity to turn Baird here from the lovable cynic into an actual interesting character in favor of a story that made the first game look complex by comparison. It's not part of this analysis. Let's move on. I talk about literary themes a lot on this show, but since most of the games I've covered so far have been high-quality interactive art, I haven't really had the chance to go over what it looks like for a game to present a variety of thematic ideas, but kind of botch the actual execution of them. But that's basically the whole story of the Gears of War trilogy. As you've seen in the previous 3 videos, this series attempts to address a number of issues, but rarely digs all that deep into them. So today, we're going to try and figure out what it is that this series is trying to say, as well as why it is that we need to dig through so much testosterone, gun explosions, blood guts shooting in order to actually understand it. Much of the reason I wanted to do this analysis in the first place is simply because Gears of War does actually have a lot to say, and most people don't really seem to realize it. They just see another loud, dumb dude bro shooter and move on. And to be fair, Gears of War is all of those things, much to the detriment of its loftier goals, but it tries to be more, and I think it's worth taking a look at what the series tried to be. Since the story is as unfocused as it is, I'm not entirely sure that I can point to any one major theme of the series necessarily. So while I normally go through all the stuff a story is saying leading up to the major point of the game, this time I'm just going to go over all the thematic elements of this series and see if we can figure it out from there. So let's rev our chainsaws and get to it. A fairly common question surrounding the discussion of video games as an art form is whether a game can simultaneously speak out against violence and have gameplay that revolves around the infliction of violence. And the answer has been pretty definitively given. Yes. Yes, they can. That said, Gears of War seems to try, but doesn't seem to want to commit itself to the concept enough to really succeed. The 2 most notable examples of managing this theme well are Metal Gear Solid and Spec Ops: The Line, and I'll certainly talk more about this whole issue when I analyze those 2 games. The broad concept that can get in the way of portraying an anti-war or anti-violence message well in video games is called ludonarrative dissonance, when the gameplay and story contradict each other to an extent that disrupts the tone and message of the game. When a story speaks out against killing and the gameplay is all about killing people, the game is sending some very mixed messages. But modern games are realizing more and more that good storytelling can solve this problem, because the player's actions in-game don't necessarily need to be praised by the game itself. And while there's a lot more to how games like Metal Gear Solid and Spec Ops solved this problem, the short version is simply that they required the player to partake in war scenarios, but designed the whole experience to quite clearly display the problems inherent in those scenarios. Gears of War doesn't quite manage this, so let's take a look at what it does try to do and why that dissonance still kind of messes it up. The key to understanding the stance Gears of War takes toward war is in understanding the backstory, specifically the Pendulum Wars. Now, the fact that the games barely reference and never fully explain the Pendulum Wars really weakens this whole concept, but if we didn't talk about some of the stuff the games failed to inform us of, we probably wouldn't be here very long. Before Emergence Day, the Locust hadn't even been heard of, and humanity was at war over emulsion. Now obviously the idea of fighting wars over valuable resources is nothing new to human history, so this makes enough sense. But a common science fiction trope is the ability to unite in the face of a greater common enemy, and the arrival of the Locust had this effect on humanity. So now, as you can imagine, the Pendulum Wars seem kind of petty in retrospect, and the death of that many humans so soon before E-Day severely weakened humanity when it came to the Locust. So whenever the Pendulum Wars are actually mentioned in the game, it's with kind of a disapproving or mournful tone. To add insult to injury and further support this theme, the thing they were fighting over turned out to be the thing they should have been fighting against in the first place. Greed led them to kill one another in competition over something that, in the chaos, went completely unnoticed as the actual threat. Hard to make an anti-war statement stronger than,
"We killed to get the stuff, and now it's killing us."
But then the Locust come in, and similar to the Pendulum Wars, the games don't actually explain them well enough to really make them count as part of this explanation, but I'll get a little bit into the expanded universe just for the sake of understanding their part in this whole thing. That pointless facility in the second game that I glossed over because it never had any established importance in the narrative of the trilogy? Yeah, that's where the Locust were created, apparently around 100 years ago. Or rather, humans suffering from emulsion sickness were sent there for examination, resulting in the creation of the Sires, whose offspring became the Locust, and Queen Mira is the descendant of the researchers, and she sympathizes with the Locust and decides to lead them on a vengeful vendetta against humanity. So basically, humanity destroyed itself in a war over emulsion, and in the process, through their greed and negligence, created a race that would eventually bring them to the brink of extinction, all while ignoring the thing that was actually trying to kill them the entire time. So in concept, it's a pretty solid condemnation of war, but in practice, there are a few things that Gears of War doesn't quite get right about it. Understanding the Locust's origins requires putting a lot of different pieces together from the game's campaigns, in-game collectibles, the books based on the series, and even forum posts from the game's creators. And even then, what we find is not even necessarily a clear canonical answer, so much as the theory that makes the most sense. And there are some logical inconsistencies that muddle the point even further. The Locust architecture we see in Gears 2 not only looks ancient, it's incredibly expansive. I doubt all this could have been built in just the span of 100 years. There's room for argument that it's not ancient, just crude and unrefined, but the continuity of architectural style and the sheer grandeur of the Nexus makes that a little hard for me to swallow. There are varying theories about the reproductive capabilities of the Locust, most of which conclude that they had been capturing humans, as seen in Gears 2, for a long time. But the idea that they'd have gone completely unnoticed while capturing that many humans over multiple decades before Emergence Day is a little ridiculous. And the main thing that ruins it for me is that the New Hope facility was governed by an AI. The only AI in the entire series. Meaning that 100 years ago, humanity was capable of producing artificial intelligence, but now there are none to be found in the story of the games. Yeah, no. All this to say, the Locust are supposed to be a major component of the series' stance against war, but between the game's failure to explain them, the plot holes that pop up while trying to explain them, and the difficulty of actually reconciling that explanation with the game's story, it really just doesn't work too well. The ending could have helped salvage it, but it really didn't. The Pendulum Wars are supposed to represent the petty destruction of humankind when we should have been uniting against a greater common threat. So then this, of course, presents the idea that war destroys lives for petty reasons when we should be working together towards common productive goals. The logical conclusion of this arc would be the unification of human and Locust against the Lambent, or at least some kind of acknowledgement that maybe the genocide of either race isn't really the preferable option in the face of the Lambent epidemic. Or it could even have ended tragically, even if the humans had won, giving whatever outcome kind of an air of tragedy, like not so many people should have died over all of this stuff, but unfortunately none of that is what happens. Instead, we get a bit of sympathy for the Locust from a single character, then a death for the Locust Queen that's significantly harder to enjoy when burdened with the knowledge that, however twisted her methods, she was just trying to save an entire race. It's not explored, it's not validated in any way, it's barely even acknowledged. So all this posturing about the futility and destruction of war, and we end by wiping out the opposition and angrily killing their leader. It's hard to say war is a bad thing when all the story's problems are solved by killing everyone. But ultimately, the failure of the series' anti-war musings mostly comes down to one simple thing. This series is obsessed with stylized and incredibly graphic violence. It revels in it. It's half the reason it even exists. There is a reason that chainsaw gun is the icon of the series. The second and third games even had a variety of different ways to execute downed enemies depending on the weapon you held, and not only did it use that as a selling point, it included achievements for seeing all of them. None of this puts the game on the same level as something like Hatred or Postal, because you're still not reveling in the blood of the innocent or anything like that. This is a war, and winning this war is actually pretty important to the continued existence of the human race. But whatever the story might say, the gameplay, the game itself does not want you to consider the horrors of war. It wants you to enjoy them. Now again, none of this is to say that you can't have enjoyable, combat-oriented gameplay in a game that tries to make an anti-war statement, but it must be done a little more skillfully and carefully than this. Gears of War's story wants to make an anti-war statement, but doesn't actually fulfill that, and the gameplay and tone actively contradict it. If you want to see how this can be done well, I refer you to the aforementioned Metal Gear Solid series and Spec Ops: The Line. Both games take very different approaches to this topic, but both of them take a pretty strong stance against war-making while still delivering enjoyable, combat-oriented gameplay that feeds into these themes rather than detracting from them. As for Gears of War, that's just one area it tried to tackle and ended up falling flat on its face instead. So let's take a look at some of the other stuff this series is trying to mean. I use the word tension here because the series doesn't really take any definitive stance on this issue until the third game, and even then it's kind of forced and incongruent with the rest of it. So honestly, when it comes to this particular theme, I don't think we're really going to find much of a concrete conclusion on this one. The biggest element of this theme in the series is the Stranded. Now, I explained briefly in the first video that the Stranded are groups of people who refused the COG's offer for food and shelter in exchange for military service because they felt that the COG was kind of fascist and over-controlling, and it was asking too much of them for providing their basic human needs. Now, despite the series depicting these people regularly since the first game, and giving them a lot of screen time in Gears 3 in particular, the series never seems to take them all that seriously. I mean, it shows us their poor living conditions, but it also makes it quite clear that they chose this life, and really they're just being jerks to the Gears who need their help to save the world. This refusal to engage the topic could be kind of justified since we are seeing this from the Gears perspective. Humanity is on the line, we're trying to save it, and these people refuse to help us. But it's also pretty clear that it is actually a bit more complex than that, and the series never really bothers to go into it. The closest we ever get is in Gears 3, when the COG is no more and our heroes are no different from the Stranded. Early on, we see some Stranded that aren't as aggressive or uncooperative as the Stranded we'd seen before, giving us a bit more of a nuanced view of them, even if it's really only for the sake of Cole's flimsy character arc. But in a filler arc in Act 4, we come across Char, a city the COG itself destroyed near the beginning of the war against the Locust. There are ashen remains of people, eternally frozen in their desperate final moments. We visit some very hateful Stranded, understandably so, and see the ruin the COG itself brought to its citizens. The ashen remains are a chilling visual, and this segment, despite its utter pointlessness in terms of the plot, really emphasizes the poor treatment of Sarah's populace by the established government. But things get a bit more unclear when we meet the leader of these Stranded, Griffin. Voiced by Ice-T, and easily the most annoying character in the game, he made a fortune before E-Day mining and refining emulsion, and has continued to do so as leader of Char's survivors. One could commend him for leading these people so effectively and keeping them alive, but listen to the way he talks about them.
You seen those ash remains? Those were my workforce, my employees.
It's very clear that he is, as he was before E-Day, I'm sure far more concerned about his business than the actual people he has running it. This whole chapter of the game doesn't exactly paint the Stranded in a positive light, and seems to imply that corruption will simply persist in this world regardless of the COG's behavior. It kinda looks like Gears of War sides pretty squarely with the COG, based on how it portrays the Stranded, but while it does occasionally hint that maybe the COG isn't as benevolent as they seem, nowhere do they reverse their pro-COG stance more blatantly than in Gears of War 3. Prescott is portrayed as a traitor who left his people behind, and when they finally found out why, it becomes only more true. The COG was playing favorites and ensuring a comfortable life for those it deemed important enough, while soldiers and Stranded struggled to even survive. So basically, we're entering the often tread sci-fi territory where the government takes Spock's advice about the needs of the many, and takes it to mean saving the powerful few so the many can maybe eventually be saved from all the stuff that's killing them off in droves. And once this is revealed, there's a lot of animosity toward Prescott and the Cog, and the game is just generally far more open about its distrust of authority, despite generally painting said authority as the good guys before now. So ultimately, it ends up kind of a mess, but the groundwork is there. So I'm actually going to try and salvage this a little bit by making kind of a stretch, admittedly, and interpreting it in light of extraneous material, the Mad World trailer. I don't have time to do a full lyrical analysis, but Mad World is a song about being simultaneously complacent and unfulfilled, about living in a system that promises eventual purpose but ultimately fails to deliver. This is where the references to childhood and school come in. It describes feeling trapped, like it's also impersonal and you're spinning your wheels, but you need to stay here so you can eventually do something actually meaningful. But then you get to adulthood and see that however excited children still are about this, nothing comes of it for you, and it's still just this mad world where people run in circles instead of achieving any true meaning, and it seems the only escape from this system is to escape from life itself. It's a cynical song, to be sure, but also sad. Some will argue that it takes a more ironic tone in the more upbeat original by Tears for Fears, but I think that Gary Jules' slower arrangement here is far more fitting for the Gears of War universe. Soldiers like we follow in this series are fighting against what seems to be an unstoppable force, and they're doing so with the help of a government that assures them their efforts will be rewarded. But they're met with nothing but death, tragedy, and even betrayal by the very system they're a part of. They really are just gears in this machine. They're tools to be used by it, and nothing more. Victory is only ever accomplished once the Cog is dissolved, and a little while afterwards it's revealed that the Cog was not really the most upstanding organization in the first place. And to add to it, there are plenty of times in the series where characters will act in the direct interest of others rather than the big picture or what the Cog would want them to accomplish, and those are generally looked up to, like Marcus trying to save his father or Dom going after Maria. This cynicism towards authority may be the main message to take from this theme of the tension between the government and its people. It's muddled at best, but it does seem to be the prevailing position the series is taking on the subject. That said, the Stranded still didn't really help at all, and the Cog did actually effectively organize the war effort for a long time, so I mean, the game never really provides an alternative or even really makes a clear point against the Cog to begin with, so it's... yeah, you know what, we're not going to come out with anything as clear on this one as we did with the last one. I mean, Gears of War kind of botched the anti-war message, but at least we knew what it was. Well, it's clear the Gears of War series was trying to say something about this. It's incredibly unclear what it actually is, so rather than trying to hurt our brains more trying to understand such inept storytelling, let's just move on to the next major theme of the series. A common theme in post-apocalyptic stories is the loss of humanity caused by, well, you know, the literal loss of humanity. That the greatest tragedy of war and large-scale destruction is in fact comprised of a million smaller tragedies. That every loss of life is a loss for humanity as a whole, and it's the culmination of all these tiny tragedies that really eats away at those who remain. Now, while an adventure game like Telltale's Walking Dead series can deftly portray this element of apocalyptic fiction through its story and characters, and a survival roguelike such as This War of Mine can put you in a position to judge for yourself how much more of humanity you're willing to sacrifice for the sake of your own survival, an action game like Gears of War finds this theme a lot more difficult to portray. Much like our previous discussion about condemning violence while prompting the player to enjoy inflicting it, it can be difficult for an action game to communicate this kind of loss and tragedy when the gameplay, by its very nature, is all about overcoming these challenges. Your entire interaction with the game is through winning in order to keep moving the story forward, and without some serious subversion of this principle, a la Shadow of the Colossus, The Last of Us, or even the 2008 Prince of Persia reboot, it can be hard to communicate anything but that victory. So Gears of War tries to manage this by introducing a string of characters who are all fated to die, but who are all connected in a way that makes all these little tragedies become one larger one. The Carmine brothers. In the Gears 2 video, I explained that these three brothers are a reference to the science fiction tradition of red shirts, characters who exist for the sole purpose of dying off in order to communicate the seriousness of a given situation. Now, Gears of War uses this trope as something of an homage to classic sci-fi, but it also kind of repurposes it and gives it new meaning. Traditionally, red shirts are expendable characters with little to no real personality or development aside from maybe a name. And while Anthony Carmine only gets a little bit more than this, Ben Carmine is actually fairly well developed and he's an enjoyable character, and Clay Carmine as well to a lesser extent. So the thing that really separates this scenario from your typical red shirt setup is the fact that all these characters are related. This simple fact changes the situation from random people dying to the members of a family slowly dying off in battle and leaving behind a dwindling set of brothers and an increasingly heartbroken mother. It's enough to add a subtle air of tragedy to every death of the Carmine brothers, and it really works to make this point strongly. I was so close to calling this the most effective thematic element of the Gears of War trilogy, and then Gears of War 3 happened. Any of you remember all of Clay Carmine's close calls? That's because after 2 games of setting up this clever repurposing of a classic sci-fi trope, they left the third Carmine brothers' fate up to a vote. Yeah, as Gears of War 3 was nearing release, they actually put his fate up to a vote and let the gaming community vote on whether he should live or die. They sold virtual t-shirts for your Xbox Live avatar so you could literally give them money to influence their decision, thus putting the resolution of one of their strongest thematic subplots in the hands of Xbox Live players. The sad thing is, Clay's fate could have actually worked either way. If he had died, it would have been maintaining the tradition and the tragic air around the characters. And if he had lived, it could have been seen as a breaking of the chain, an admission that no one else needs to die now that this war is over. But instead, they put his fate to a vote and just spent the entire game teasing us about its outcome. Heck, months before Gears of War 3 released, Gavin Dune, known online as Miracle of Sound, made a song called The Ballad of Clay Carmine, and that 5-minute song did far more justice to the character than the entire runtime of Gears of War 3.
Born to a world of struggle, raised with my brothers 3. As a boy I learned through a burning world that nothing ever comes for free. As soon as I could hold a gun now, I was out on the killing fields, fighting in the war to save my home from a foe that will never yield. But we won't stop because we're brothers in blood now. We'll meet again now at the end of the line. Try not to think about what fate throws before me. Reporting for duty, sir. What's your name, son? Robert Clay Carmine.
Granted, that's because Gavin is just a brilliant lyricist and talented musician, and he often upstages the actual games he writes about, but still. As far as I'm concerned, they completely broke this subplot and its meaning when they did this. That they would compromise their artistic integrity like this just for the sake of making a few bucks off a cheap publicity stunt just makes me sick. How much did they get off this anyway? Let's find out. Alright, here we go. The Live or Die campaign raised $150,000 for the Penny Arcade Child's Play charity. Oh. Well, now I feel like kind of a horrible person. Okay, I'm glad that charity money was raised. That was really good of Epic Games to do that. Okay, how to put this? Speaking from a strictly narrative perspective, I believe the decision to treat Clay in this way undermined the thematic weight of what was otherwise a clever and impacting way of depicting the small tragedies of war in what is otherwise a brainless action fest, and I believe the story is worse off for it. So, I guess that's all I have to say about that. This is a pretty general thematic topic, but it's certainly presented here and even a little bit fleshed out. The series portrays loss in nearly every facet of its visual and narrative design, and even a bit through the gameplay if you really wanted to stretch things. So, I mean really just not at all through the gameplay actually, but it could be kind of fun to try and figure something out there. The art book that came with the special edition of the first game is entitled Destroyed Beauty, and it's appropriately titled because that's a major theme of the game's visuals. They suffer from being right near the beginning of the gray and brown trend in games, where the game was genuinely breaking from the norm by being so dark and drab, but the actual design of the environments, specifically the ruins of human cities, is quite impressive. Architecture isn't really my area, but I've seen the buildings described as having European and Gothic inspirations, but ultimately being fairly original stylistically. It gives the game a nice, haunting atmosphere and effectively makes the player acutely aware of how beautiful the world must have been before the war. Making the player think about what was by showing them what's left is a very nice way to communicate dramatic loss, and while I've seen it done a bit better in games with more varied color palettes, the architectural design really makes Gears stand out in this regard. But aside from that, most of the characters have lost something as well. Dom lost his family, Marcus lost his father, and in kind of a weird way his innocence too, and Cole lost his career. Even Baird lost his position in the military, though we're not getting into judgment here, and that wasn't even made clear in the trilogy itself. The Carmine brothers subplot plays into this theme as well. Gears of War shows a variety of characters experiencing and dealing with loss in a variety of ways. Now this is primarily the domain of Dom's arc, which I've talked about enough in previous videos that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but essentially, he lost someone he loved, and he spent the entire series consumed with trying to get her back, and in the end ended up purposefully going to her instead. Marcus lost his father, but that's not actually the defining element of his character. His most important loss was actually given up of his own will when he defied orders to save his father. He lost his rank, his position, and his freedom by making that choice, and the result is a jaded and cynical person who doesn't have much faith in the system he's a part of. Further backstory reveals him to have idolized Gears growing up, loving the idea of fighting for what's important alongside the people closest to you. But while war has made him jaded, as it tends to, the real breaking point for him was when he was asked, after many years of loyal service, to leave his father to die, then punished for refusing to obey that order. That order, and his punishment for refusing it, seems to have been the final nail in the coffin for Marcus's faith in his own cause. I mean, he doesn't even really seem all that cooperative with the COG throughout most of this story, and Gears 2 is the only time that he really seems to be going along with what they're doing. All this to say, Marcus had actually lost a sort of innocence, the very idea of dignity as a soldier of the COG. It's not an entirely bad loss, really, as he's essentially disillusioned and sees things more clearly as a result, but it definitely had a negative effect on his morale and disposition. And of course, Gears 3 takes even more away from him, leaving him to contemplate how to even live in a world he saved with no war, no Dom, and no family. Which is probably why the game shoved a romance with Anya in there, to give him some level of hope after everything that's happened and everything he's lost. And Cole? Cole might actually be the most emotionally healthy character in this game. Most mature? Absolutely not, but most emotionally healthy? Maybe. I mean, think about it. Dom's response to loss was to chase what he had lost until it eventually led to his death. Marcus's response was to retreat into cynicism and detachment. Cole started out pretty clearly repressing some of his issues with all that childish yelling and whooping, but ultimately that stupid scene with the bomb in the old Thrashball Stadium was him not only reliving what he had lost, but actually bringing it into his current situation. He didn't mope, he didn't detach, he didn't chase it, but given the opportunity, he used it, came to terms with it, and moved forward. I mean, that scene was still really stupid, and his character development wasn't especially well done, but looking at all the characters, it certainly seems like he did a better job dealing with all of this than anyone else in the cast. Point is, everyone's lost something in Gears of War, and everyone has reacted to it in a different way, at least to the extent that they can, given the poor character development of the series. The loss of civilization is very poignantly communicated through some impressive architectural and environmental design, and even the Locust have lost something, but considering the series doesn't really want to acknowledge that, I don't really feel like giving them the credit. It's hardly an examination of grief on the same level as stories like The Last of Us, or some would argue The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, but it does make a point of showing us various kinds of loss and various ways of dealing with it by various characters. So, I mean, it's definitely not pulled off with deft artistic precision, but it certainly is there. This last theme is actually kind of conflicting for me, because in a way it feels more like an excuse than a proper reading. Like, it takes the series' major failings and kind of turns them into a workable element of the narrative. Like we're trying to get a positive reading out of it, even if it's not necessarily all that legitimate. But nevertheless, it is interesting, and I do think it works pretty well. I mentioned Metal Gear Solid earlier. In the first game, Solid Snake spends a lot of time talking about the way soldiers are really just being used, and he takes a lot of issue with the way that people are used as tools by the government they work for. And in a way, Gears of War reflects very similar themes. The title is the first giveaway. These soldiers are gears. They're nothing more than parts in a machine. They can't decide how the machine runs or what it accomplishes. They only help it to work. They just take orders and accomplish the goals of the larger machine. This means they're trained not to ask questions or think about the larger situation, simply to act as instructed. The entire mission thus far was to kill the Locust and their queen and save humanity from this threat. So while the story doesn't put enough thought into the sympathy it hints at for the Locust, this could be justified by the interpretation that it's from the Gears' perspectives. In this reading, Gears of War is more of a tragic story than a victorious one, and it ties into the anti-war themes we were talking about earlier. In the backstory, and now even into the main story, these characters have only ever fought at the whims of mankind's greedy and violent tendencies. But in Gears of War 3, the characters are given an opportunity to try and rise above this tendency. With the cog dissolved, the power to make these important decisions is now in their hands, and if they wanted to, they could try and find a better solution. But the only person to really try was Adam Phoenix, and he failed to successfully do so, resulting in the genocide of the Locust. Now, this put the responsibility for better behavior directly in the hands of the soldiers, these people who have only recently been liberated from their previous controllers and are now given the opportunity to be better than them, and faced with the Locust Queen. And we all know how that turned out. Even freed from the Order to mindlessly inflict violence, it's all they know and all they can really do, all they know to do. Even after the machine falls apart, the gears can't change their function. Ultimately, this rather dark and cynical interpretation is kind of destroyed by the cliché hopeful ending. We could certainly read the events, and even Marcus's perspective on the whole thing, as tragic, but the game pretty clearly isn't going for that here. Excluding the last minute or so of the trilogy, however, this actually is a fairly effective way to read the series' weaknesses as strengths. This is why there's so little exposition, so little thought to the bigger issues of the series, and such a jarring ending. There's more to it, but we're soldiers. We don't question these things, we just act as instructed. And even freed of that control, this brash action is all that we know. I feel like I should specify, since I have kind of been bashing it this whole time, I actually really like Gears of War. I mean, I played the multiplayer a lot during my teenage years, and I have cherished playing through each and every new campaign with my cousin the day it comes out. It's severely flawed, but I really do like the series. Ultimately, that's why I wanted to do this analysis. Because Gears of War is loud, it's gory, it's stupid, it's obviously trying to appeal to the stereotypical frat boy demographic that only plays video games to shoot other dudes in the face. But it tried to be more, it wanted to be more. And people seem to forget that, or sometimes not even notice it in the first place. Obviously, I don't think it really succeeded. A few moments of brilliance shone through, but people seem to have mistaken these moments of brilliance for the only times that Gears of War held any real level of meaning. In reality, that meaning was always there, but those few moments are really just the only times that we actually get to see it, that it gets to shine past all of the gunplay and chainsaws. If Gears of War didn't try to craft a compelling narrative, I couldn't call it a failure. I mean, it's hard to fail at something you never tried to do in the first place. But it did try. It wanted to mean something. It wanted to accomplish something on a narrative level, but ultimately it just couldn't overcome its own noise, its own obsession with blood, guns, and action heroes to actually deliver on the narrative themes and the narrative power it really wanted to. But in the end, it did try. I mean, obviously that doesn't make it a success, but I do think it's worth acknowledging that this series did try to be more than just another game about shooting aliens. I mean, success or no, that is more than we get from most other games in this genre, and I do think it's worth something. This is why I find this series so interesting to examine. To dig meaning out from under a pile of rubble is an incredibly rewarding process, and I find it very valuable to examine flawed works like this and see what they tried to accomplish, what they wanted to mean, and why they, for one reason or another, just couldn't quite let that meaning shine through. So I hope you found this examination of the Gears of War trilogy just as interesting to watch as it was for me to make it. That said, I am never doing 3 games at once, ever again. This was insane. I am tired, and now my longest and most detailed analysis thus far is on Gears of freaking War of all things. So, here's hoping I can keep the next analysis down to a reasonable running time. If you want to follow my weekly discussions and monthly literary analyses, then check out Games is Lit on Facebook and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you really like what this show is doing, please consider supporting it on Patreon. That link is in the description. Your support helps make this show better, and you can even make me do an episode on a topic of your choosing. Next week, we are finally getting back to normal episodes of Games is Lit 101. And I'm going to be talking a bit about localization, and more specifically the way that Nintendo is currently handling a situation with Fatal Frame 5. And next month on Literary Analysis, I will have been doing this for an entire year. So, you know what? You have asked and asked and asked. So fine. I'll analyze The Last of Us. So until next week, class dismissed.
Now the cities are laid to ruin, and we fight on through the years. No end in sight, no light of hope, man, don't it just grind your gears? But we won't stop because we're brothers in blood now. We'll meet again now at the end of the line. Try not to think about what fate throws before me. Reporting for duty.